Is the reason you came to Japan on promotion this time because you have a high opinion of Japan as a market, or what was behind the whole plan to come to Japan?
Well, any excuse to travel is very welcome. Something I've always done since I was a kid. I've never been to Japan. I always wanted to. Also, I think that all over the world, everywhere is becoming very cosmopolitan. So I'd like to come to the East before it becomes too much like the West, or vice versa. I would have liked to have come and played concerts, which I will do maybe next year. But I think it's important first that there's enough interest in my music to make it really worthwhile bringing a band over.
What kind of response have you had from the Japanese audience to your music that you know of?
That I know of, I think it's been good. I think, as I understand it, the problem here is slightly the same as in England. It's very difficult to get video films shown unless you've already got a record in the charts through the radio, I suppose. That's was always a problem for me in England. It's maybe why the first place that I broke through was in America, where with cable TV and so on, my videos got shown anyway. And then the radio started to pick up, and I got stuff in the charts. I think I'm probably now more or less as well known in my home country, I'm glad to say, as I am in the States. But there are other parts of the world where I'd like to break through as well.
You had Akiko Yano sing on, was it Radio Silence? It's a funny thing, that was on only one of the versions. There's a zillion versions of that album out everywhere. I have a couple of them at home. How did you?
I wouldn't mind a cup of tea, actually.
How did you get tied up with her? Do you have any other connections with Japanese musicians?
Well, not really. A journalist friend of mine in London had spoken to YMO when they were over in England playing concerts, and I mentioned to him that I needed an interesting vocalist for the record, and he said, well, that Akiko was over in London at the time, and so I got in touch with her, and she came out to the studio with a friend that she said spoke slightly better English than her, and I thought that he was introduced to me as Luigi. And I thought, well, it's very bizarre to have a Japanese with an Italian name. So I was then, I was in the studio with Akiko, showing her a very complicated 5-part harmony on the piano. And she said, well, I think the best thing is if Luigi comes and writes it down. And Luigi had been in the other room and came through, and he played me the piano part by ear.
Is it right?
Yeah, the whole of the piano part, which he just heard on the speakers, and I suddenly thought this guy must be a fantastic musician. And then suddenly it clicked, that I imagined it would be pronounced Ryuki or something like that, so it didn't make sense. And then suddenly I realised who it was.
Did that lead to any other work with him after that?
Not really. I'm hoping to see him while I'm here.
I understand you're going to be on his radio program.
That's right. Yeah.
Because I did work at the same station. One thing that always struck me funny about him, he's always impressed me as a brilliant musician, but again, the stuff he did with YMO wasn't all that hot, was he?
I think it's really varied, I think they were very experimental, and I think they're ahead of their time.
Had you been paying much attention to them?
Little bits and pieces, yeah. I mean, unfortunately, a lot of Japanese music doesn't get that much exposure in Britain, and even less in the States. I was vaguely aware of what they were doing, along with a few of the bands that had been over there, like Ikuto, Sending in the Sunsets, the Plastics, and things like that, bands like that. But I was no expert on Japanese music. In a way, in fact, the band Japan popularised it a lot because of their fascination with it. And I think that the contribution that Ryuichi made to Japan's music was really good.
How about, since coming here, have you had any exposure to any of the locals?
Well, I only arrived last night. So
okay, sorry, I didn't know. Yeah, no, I can put you on that. General impressions on the Japanese music you've heard, is there anything applicable to all these bands? that you could sum them up by?
Not really. No, I'm not enough of an expert on it. But it's amazing to me how different the culture is really. Just from that point of view, in a way, in pop and rock music is where it comes closest. That's I haven't seen much of Japan yet, but I thought, well, if that's the closest that it ever comes, they must be really real worlds apart, and that's what fascinates me about coming to Japan anyway. It's a little bit like if you imagine what the music must be like on Mars, how it must be very different. But I do really like what I've heard. It's obviously difficult to listen to music in a language that you don't understand. But there again, it's hard for Japanese singers to sing in English because they know they might be making fools of themselves. It's the same way as it would be hard for us to sing in Japanese.
And one thing for me about your music is that you mention America every now and then. But like some of the songs were even written before you even went to America. Am I mistaken? Had you already been there?
No, I'd already been there.
Oh, Brooklyn is crawling with famous people. Where the British meet. What is it, in L.A. The Screen Kiss? Why do you deal with those places?
I deal with everywhere that I go. There's a lot of reference to Europe as well. I see. I've always tended to steer clear of the kind of "Ooh, baby, I love you." I was working as a cocktail in a cocktail bar, kind of accessing music, and I always thought that what I had to offer was really my view of the world. I'm an observer and narrator, if you like, and so it's it might be about nature, or else it might be about man and nature, or else just about man. But I'm very impressionable, and to go anywhere that seems alien to me always sparks off some ideas. So the first time I went to the States, just before I made my album, that obviously gave me some things to sing about.
I'm often confused by your lyrics. I get the humor behind songs like, She Blinded Me With Science and Hyperactive and stuff, but other ones like Weightless just leave me completely vacant. I really can't figure out what's going on there. I kind of get sort of an image. Do you ever get the same kind of response from other people as well? Or do you find people really read a lot into your lyrics?
Well, they do read. Some of them do read a lot into my lyrics. Yeah, but my lyrics are impressionistic. They're not designed to make sense in a literary way. I wouldn't want groups of students sort of studying the inner meanings of them. If I can convey a feeling that I've had myself, then that's enough. I think that's one of the functions of poetry, really. It's a form of emotional communication. It's not just academic or intellectual communication.
One of my theories is it seems to be like phonetic use of the words more than like literal usage. At least
that happens as well sometimes.
I'm getting away here. It's a reasonable thing, What about you've been apparently understood or taken to be a mad scientist because of your videos? Is that something you try to get away from, rather? You look back on that and regret having done it?
Oh no, I've never felt bogged down by anything I've done. I think that my fans can appreciate the humour behind what I do, and they don't take it all at face value. I've always identified myself as a loner, an eccentric, really, and that's the aspects of my personality that I tend to bring out in videos. It's about as far away as you can get from the image that a lot of bands tend to put over. It's very sort of streetwise, very hip, very chummy thing. And so I put myself in these odd settings, whether it's on a psychiatrist's couch, or whether it's as a crazed ventriloquist and hyperactive, or whatever.
Is there any way you'd like to be seen, though? How do you want to come across to your fans? How would you like them to see you?
Well, you see, the thing is, I think I'm very much an anti-hero in an age where there are a lot of big heroes. There's the Bowies, the Michael Jacksons, and so on. I knew from the beginning that I wasn't, I couldn't dance like Michael, and I wasn't as good looking as David Sylvie and so on, and that really what was going to interest people about what I had to do was more of a personality thing, and so I tend to sort of play on the underdog. I tend to, a little bit like silent movie heroes, like sort of Chaplin and Lloyd and Keaton. They were always the underdog. They were always in an impossible situation, and they just used their ingenuity and their charm to get themselves out of it.
What about, say, back when you were younger? Did you always feel you were the underdog back then as well? For the early days of adolescence.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I was always very much on my own. I never really imagined myself sort of out in the spotlight. I tended to activate things for other people. I ran a film club, and I used to make charts of the weather, and I used to sail a lot. I was always into navigation.
Is that right?
And it was just down to my imagination, really. Because I travelled around a lot as a kid. I had to be prepared to lose friends. It wasn't like growing up in a street corner with the same bunch of people and getting older that way. And for that reason, a lot of my fun had to come from my own imagination.
Did you ever settle down, or were you constantly on the move when you were a kid?
Yeah, I was always in the move until I left school when I was about 16. I settled in London and started trying to make a living as a musician.
Oh, is that right? From the age of 16. How does a 16-year-old go about trying to make a living as a musician?
Well, to start off with, I mean, the only thing I could do at all well was play a bit of sort of jazz piano. So I used to play in wine bars and restaurants.
Just cocktail jazz.
Yeah, it was. Well, it wasn't. No, it wasn't really cocktail jazz. It wasn't like hotel lounge jazz particularly. It was a little bit more, a bit more conviction than that. Although I probably, to tell you the truth, I probably never really had the discipline to make it as a cocktail jazz pianist anyway.
Were you self-taught?
Yeah.
Completely?
Yeah. I picked up a bit of music theory from singing in a choir.
Thomas,
Give it to you, would be great.
Getting back to your background a little bit more, you started from the age of 16, you say, playing in bars and whatnot. When did you first appear on record, though?
Well, at home I used to mess around with a tape recorder, and I started. I mean, I borrowed a synthesizer and I started fooling around with that, and that opened up a sort of new world of sort of textures and atmospheres that I wasn't really aware of before. So I started to write with snippets of songs. I didn't really have the kind of craft of songwriting particularly. So I decided to work with some songwriters co-writing, and one of them was a guy called Bruce Woolley, who wrote Video Killed the Radio Star. He's one of the original buggers with Trevor Horn and Jeff Dowd. And I picked up a lot of tips from him, and he formed a band later on and asked me to join it, and I thought that was worth a crack.
And that was when you were how old?
That's when I was 19. And I played on his record. Through him I met a lady called Lena Lovitch, for whom I wrote New Toy. And that was one of the first songs of my own that came out as a single, instead as a cover of somebody else's. I played with Lena for a while, and I started getting asked to work with other people. But I didn't really want to be a sideman for the rest of my life, so with the money that I made from guesting on other people's albums, I continued my songwriting, and I recorded my first solo single with the help of a guy called Andy Partridge from XTC, and it came out on an independent label called Armageddon.
What single was that?
It was called Urges.
Oh, Urges.
Yeah.
Sure.
Leipzig and the B-side. And from there, that attracted a lot of press and sort of interest in the business in London. And people became interested in me. I was writing more and more stuff, and I got together an album's worth of material and formed my own label. And
Venice and Pearl.
Venice and Pearl. And EMI got interested in that, and so I made my album.
And Annie Partridge says you kept on sending a bunch of tapes and wanted to become a member of XTC.
That's right, yeah. Well, my two favourite bands. The thing is that the era that I was living in London as my late teens, the most exciting thing happening was punk. And I used to go to a lot of punk clubs. I saw the Pistols and the Clash, and in those days the Jam and the Police were regarded as punk bands as well. I went to see them, and I used to hang out with I had a lot of friends who used to go to all the gigs and live the whole lifestyle, sort of sleeping in the back of a van outside the Roxy in the car park and stuff like that. But musically it had something lacking for me, although it had all the energy. So when people like XTC, Talking Heads, Susie and the Banshees came along, suddenly that got me very interested in playing with bands, because it had the energy of punk, but it had a little bit more musical content to it. XTC were my favourite band, and when they had a great keyboard player called Barry Andrews who left them, and I very much wanted to fill in his spot, but by that stage they decided to just have another guitarist instead.
Because I recall they threw out Barry Andrews though, because they said he wasn't really contributing to the band, he was wearing them down.
I don't really know. I think they had the musical differences. He was from London, they were from Swindon. Personally, I think he gave their early music a lot of character and a lot of spark, which wasn't so much in evidence in their later albums. I think their first 2 or 3 albums were their best. And
he now is in Shriekback. Did you keep track much of what's going on music-wise back home?
Well, I don't go out of my way to keep up with it particularly. I occasionally go to clubs and I talk to musicians and so on. But I've always had this kind of disrespect for musical styles. I didn't really grow up on. I mean, if I'd grown up on a street corner in, I don't know, the East End or the Bronx or Trenchtown, Jamaica or somewhere, I might have a kind of root in one particular style of music, which would limit me. And as it is, I've always been a musical explorer. Really, I think I've always tried to break new ground for myself and experiment. Not in a sort of arty way, not in a Laurie Anderson, Brian Eno way, but just to keep widening my vocabulary. And for that reason, occasionally I hear something on the radio that I like. Occasionally I pick up a copy of The Face or NME. But aside from that, I don't. I'm not an obsessive follower of the music scene. Really.
Speaking of influence, I think you mentioned before that Lena Lovitch was one of the ones who influenced you the most. I think meeting her was like a turning point. And another one seems to have influenced you a lot is Joni Mitchell. At least I feel that from the music. Is that true?
That's certainly true. Yeah. She's a great lyricist and at times very abstract with her music. She, in a way, is identified with that sort of whole sort of laid-back West Coast feeling of music, and yet I think when she's at her best, she transcends all of that. I saw her live at the end of last year, and when she was on her own, she was fantastic. When she was with the band, although they were very proficient, very slick, it bored me.
Oh, really?
Yeah, because it suddenly rooted it to LA, Whereas when she was on her own, just playing the guitar or piano or whatever, it was just completely lost in time. It was completely timeless.
But Screen Kiss, the lyrics to that remind me a hell of a lot of Joni Mitchell. Could you be equating Joni Mitchell with LA in your mind? That's why you made the location for Screen Kiss LA, or is that just a foolish assumption on my part?
Well, that actually came about because it was a story of an English girl, a friend of mine, who kind of went to LA with the American dream, I suppose, and couldn't find it anywhere. In a way, in that song, I was more voicing the dissatisfaction of the people who live there or the people who go there than just kind of slagging it off from a distance. It was rather strange. I did a concert at the Greek Theatre up in the hills above Old Hollywood, and that seemed very strange to be singing those lyrics there. And I had to stop in the middle and sort of apologise and say, look, I hope you don't take this the wrong way. But No, I mean it wasn't. I mean it's certainly a nod in the direction of Joni Mitchell. It's certainly acknowledging my roots in that sense. Yeah.
It's funny that you get a lot of influence from women. Do you think women can do stuff with music that men can't?
Yeah, certainly. I think there's a kind of emotional intensity about. But that, you see, that doesn't necessarily mean that only women can do it. You know, I mean, I think at times there's a kind of femininity and a sensuality as well about Boy George, about Marvin Gaye, even about Al Green. It's just not an essentially sort of masculine thing, and that's something that I've always really liked. You know.
What about yourself? Do you feel there's that sort of androgynous quality to yourself as well? You feel you can associate with women sometimes more than men? Well,
sometimes, yeah. I can associate more with women than I can with kind of leather-clad, studded heavy metal singers, you know, Neanderthals, yeah, certainly.
How about in your own case, like when you're growing up or even now? Are most of your friends male or female?
Both, really. I mean, I'm a romantic. I tend to fall passionately in love with people, and when that happens, all sorts of juices start flowing that have maybe been dormant for a month or a year or whatever. It's certainly very important to me to live a little bit in between writing songs and performing them, because if my life was just a constant round of hotel rooms and record company offices and interviews, then I'd have nothing left to write songs about. So I tend to go out and meet new people and find new places, and stock up again on impressions and images.
You find that your work allows you that much time, though? I would think you'd be busy almost year-round.
No, well, I mean, I am very busy, yeah. You have to put your foot down, though, sometimes. The difficult thing is there's always something constructive to do, you know. There's always a backlog of people that you need to talk to, or ideas with writers or musicians that need following up. There's always something to be done, but every now and then you have to step back from it, because it's very easy to lose objectivity.
Everybody and their brother, praising Thomas Dolby as the happening thing right now. I would imagine that people are trying to break your doors down, getting you to write songs or producing their records. Have the offers been frequent?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's quite a lot on offer. There's not a lot of people that I really feel I could help with what they're doing.
How's
particularly? Well, you see, I don't. What I'm not interested in is being hired like a piece of outboard equipment. A lot of people phone me up and they want the sound of my record for their record, and that doesn't really interest me really, because it doesn't stretch me at all. What does interest me more though is that I've always been very impressionable. A lot of my best work has been when I'm under somebody's influence. Whether it was Lena, whether it was Joan Armatrading or Malcolm McLaren, or just interesting personalities. I can go to work for them, and I can contribute to and expand on what they're doing already. And those kind of situations interest me. But I always try and make them as varied as possible. I wouldn't like to be typecast as doing one particular thing. After the success of Shibani with Science, I would get everybody from Berlin to bands who obviously would like to head in that kind of direction sound-wise would phone up and ask if I was interested, and I don't think there's really anything I can do for them.
Is there any tempting offers you were seriously considering, but maybe time-wise or for some other reason you weren't able to do it?
I tend to try and make time. I mean, the kind of following that I have are prepared to wait a few more months to get the right records. That there's not this sort of constant pressure on me to produce 2 albums a year of my own and tour and do interviews and so on. I think that people see me as more of a long-term. I'm just a character who's there. I'm glad to say, and I'm not in the mainstream of pop bands who are sort of flavour of the month. And if they don't change their hairstyles and their clothes, then they'll be out of vogue.
Are there any plans to work with any other people?
I've got a few plans in the offing. Yeah, I don't really want to talk about them because it might jeopardise my sort of chances of it ever happening. That can tend to get out of hand. I had this ridiculous situation over the work I was doing for Michael Jackson that really exploded, and it's kind of slightly tainted. I think our desire to work together because there's been so much stuff about it in the press and so on.
Yeah, well, the British press seems to assume you're going to be producing his next record.
Yeah, well, it's a case of Chinese whispers, really. You know, I mean, a British newspaper will find some small article in a minor American newspaper and then exaggerate it, and then an American paper will see it in an English paper and exaggerate that. So it all got completely out of hand, really.
May overlap with that we were talking about, but apparently she read in an interview somewhere that you said the flat earth, well, when you got people together for it, you basically left their parts up to them, or left the musicianship to them, and it kind of came as sort of a fusion of all that, of all the different styles. Is that the approach you took, or are you more of a, did you have everything, you know, in your own hand, everything you control?
Well, on my first album, before I ever mastered it, I needed a set of elaborate demos that would get me the record deal in the first place. So on the first album I knew exactly what the arrangements were. If I decided that instead of using a synthesizer I'd like a guitar or a violin or a flute, then I would phone up a flute player and get him in, and I would build up layer upon layer like that. On this album I wanted it much more to have the feeling of a band playing together. So what I did was that I picked the musicians that I wanted to work with, which were really a bassist, a guitarist and a percussionist who also programmed computer drums. And we went off to Belgium. We lived in an apartment together, spent a lot of time together, and I had vague ideas for songs. What I would do though was I would get them in the studio, I would get a groove going between maybe the bass and the drums, and I would rush around suggesting to the guitarist a chord to play, suggesting to the drummer a new accent to put in, or to the bassist a voicing to use, and also to the engineer. He would be working on the sounds. I'd maybe suggest an echo effect, and I would get them playing it for maybe half an hour at a time, and I'd be rushing around humming tunes to myself and writing down bits of lyrics, and the song would really develop that way. But that meant that although I made suggestions to the musicians, the parts at the end of the day were their own.
Is that right? Why did you come up with something like Dissidence? Why Dissidence? Why did you choose to deal with that sort of subject matter?
Well, in a way it was the theme song for the album, because very often my songs take a kind of fictional story and draw parallels with my own experience with real life, what's happening to me. After the success of my first album, and specifically She Blinded Me with Science, a lot of people would have expected me to take a formula from it and just repeat it. And that to me was completely alien to everything that I stand for, because as I was saying earlier on, I have to keep moving on. And the album that I felt inclined to make was a lot more relaxed, a lot more introspective than the kind of up-tempo, humorous, electric funk that people maybe identified me with. And that meant taking a risk, really. It meant sticking my neck out and saying, okay, you've heard this phase of my music, here is a new phase. If you like me, you'll like this as well. You won't force me into the mould of continuing my success musically. And so the parallel that I could see in a fictional sense was with a dissident, with a subversive writer, working under pressure from the establishment, from the government. As I very often do, I started to imagine it as a film clip. It's very often the way that my songs develop, is that I think of it in pictures, think of it in cinema, and that then leads to a whole new set of ideas, and the song becomes written.
What was the first video you ever did?
Europa and the Pirate Twins.
Oh, really? It must have been something you looked forward to then, if you kind of had these... Were you able to create what you had in mind?
Yeah, I've gotten better at it these days. In the early days, I never really knew how much could be achieved, in a day's filmmaking. So I think on Europa and the Pirate Twins and on Airwaves and Radio Silence, possibly at the end of the day we didn't end up shooting everything that I needed, so the story was no longer hung together. So it ended up a few sort of disjointed impressions that maybe worked, but not complete. These days I'm much better at estimating how much I can get away with on film, so it's easier for me to get the whole story over.
One thing that sticks in my mind from an interview of yours I read a while back was right after you'd come out, people were comparing you to the Thompson Twins, and I think other groups, and I remember you saying that when you were asked a question like that, you became very depressed and couldn't get over it for a couple of days. Have those comparisons stopped? Like that, I'm sure you compare a lot to Howard Jones these days.
Yeah, well, those kind of comparisons are really an unfortunate habit of people in the media, I think. I accept that it's necessary. If the Japanese public have heard of the Thompson Twins and Howard Jones but never heard of me, then it may be worthwhile saying, well, if you like the Thompson Twins and Howard Jones, you'll probably like Dolby. I can see the value in that kind of a comparison. But I think as far as the public are concerned, my music occupies a different part of their affection from anybody else's. I think that in a way I'm more different from everything else that's going on than a lot of people. I don't belong to any trend. I don't belong to any movement particularly. I'm very much out on a limb. And one year I might make a very obviously accessible record which will compete in the charts with everything else that's going on. Another year I might make a record that is destined to be a cult record only, and that maybe a couple of people would die to get their hands on, but will not feature very highly in the charts. That I think it balances out really. I think the more commercial side of what I do balances up with the more avant-garde side.
What do you think you have to offer people through the music? Is it solely entertainment?
Yeah, it's entertainment. It's escapism of one type or another. Sometimes it's one man's view of the world. It's something that takes you to a different place, rather like a Joseph Conrad novel or a Werner Herzog film will transport you out of your existence and somewhere else. Another time it's just it's like a cartoon really. In the case of Shibano Science or Hyperactive, it's like reading a strip cartoon. It's a harmless confection.
What about, say, in a place like Japan where maybe people are not going to be able to understand the lyrics?
Yeah, I think even then, I think the music is impressionistic, and I think it's very personal to me, and I think the tunes are hummable, and I think it's danceable. So we'll have to see. Really.
Couple things there. First of all, the flat Earth, is that an observation or a desire?
Well, when I was thinking of names for my album, one of them that came up, I wanted very much to give an impression of exploration, because I felt that's the kind of album it had been for me. And one of the ideas that came up was the flat Earth. I mentioned it to my brother, who's an astronomer, and he said that he'd actually once written an article, a kind of post-Einstein theory of why the Earth was flat. That in fact NASA and the Kremlin had been lying to us. They'd falsified satellite photographs of the Earth. They'd actually known for 40 or 50 years that the Earth was really flat. That in fact it was a disk spinning horizontally in space, and it had two black holes under the North and South Pole that created such an energy field that light travelled faster around the outside of the disk, so that as you move towards the edge of the disk, light actually appears to curve around on itself. And so you'd never fall off the edge, because what we take to be straight lines are actually parabolic curves. And that I thought was very amusing. And so I think after he explained this theory to me, that just about settled it. I decided to call the album The Flat Earth.
I see. She also wants to know about the lyrics as well. It's probably going to overlap with what we were talking about, but she sees it them as very optimistic. I guess it's very positive. You don't really have any desire to change anything with them, do you? To change people's thoughts, to change the way things are.
I think it would be presumptuous of me to imagine that I could do it single-handedly. But I think that you're right to say it's optimistic. The title song, The Flat Earth, it doesn't talk about the neo-magnetic theory of the structure of space, but it says the Earth can be any shape you want it. So in other words, if everybody decides that the Earth is going to be a warm place, that it's going to be a friendly and peaceful place, then that's the way it'll be. If we decide that it has to be hostile and it has to be greedy, then that's the way it'll be as well. So, I mean, it is optimistic, yeah.
And also travel all over the place. Do you find good in everywhere you go, or do you have some favorite certain places that you want to go back to and others that I want to kind of stay away from? Was it pretty much just a case of wanting to go to new places all the time?
I tend to stay away from East London.
What's wrong with East London?
Well, it's full of kind of construction sites and football louds and things like that.
Oh, I see. How about in your travels, though? What are some
in my travels?
The highlights.
Yeah, well, I went last year I sailed around the Greek islands with my father and a friend of mine and his father, and that was really amazing because my father's an archaeologist, and we were retracing steps that going to places where he used to go to dig when he was in his 20s, which had obviously changed quite a lot. I also took my bass player and his father, who used to be a merchant seaman during the war, and so he'd been to the same places as well. And there were some old men on some of the islands that remembered my father from 50 years ago, and so on. And that was really fascinating. You know. I've always shared this sort of fascination with people and places.
How far do you think your music can take you? Is Japan the remotest place your music has brought you to? Has it been mostly...
I don't think Japan is particularly remote. It just happens to be further away from England than you know a lot of places where I've been. No, I mean I'd love to go and tour some really remote places. I'd like to go to Africa, to South America, and Indonesia and so on. But my imagination transports me to places where I've never been. There's a song on the album called "Moo the Rainforest," which at the time I knew very little about, but I'd read a little bit about it, and it's actually in Borneo, really. The song that I wrote was very much a white European's view of the place, rather than an expertly informed explorer's view of it.
What about this trip? Where else are you going to be going?
This trip is just to Japan. I've just finished a 5.5-month world tour, which I say world tour, it was really North America and Europe and the UK.
And then come to Japan, and then what comes after this?
Well, I'm going back a long route, and probably I can stop off somewhere in the Pacific, and then again in the States, and then eventually go back to Britain.
To do what? What are you going to do when you get back?
I'm writing a film script, which I'm going to try and get some backing for.
What kind of film is it?
I don't want to give too much away, but I mean it's an idea that I've had for some time. It's called Dolby's Cube, and there's a lot of interest in it. In Hollywood, I went to see some of the film companies. They're very keen at the moment to kind of take the talent from the promo industry and do something with it on a bigger scale. But it would probably involve guests. It would probably involve some of my favourite musicians and singers making sort of cameo performances, and I would write and produce songs with them. So it'd be a collection of songs. It'd be vaguely a musical, but not very, very fantastic, I think.
Well, like basically a full-length rock video.
No, I'd be very worried to say a rock video, but it'll be really a vehicle for my own peculiar kind of talent, really, in the same way that Jack Tatty writes films that are a vehicle for his character, and Charlie Chaplin did the same.
Is it going to be a real film or video?
Be a real film.
Sort of about the concert, you pretty much maintain the same format, right? Is that going to change for the next tour?
I think it will always change. Yeah. I mean, I needed really a very flexible group of musicians, because we had to play both material from my first album, which originally I'd played a lot of it I played all myself, and also from the new album, which is more acoustic, more percussive generally. So I have guitar, bass and drums, and then I have 3 keyboard players who also do bits of percussion, a lot of backing vocals, and so on. So it's quite a flexible setup. I myself tend not to play very much these days. I play just really the cream of the keyboard parts, a bit of the grand piano. But I tend to move about a lot more and concentrate on communicating with the audience a bit.
You think you do communicate with them well?
I think I've sort of found the performer within myself. I mean, there's no Frank Sinatra book of stage presence or Lisa Minnelli book of how to talk to an audience or anything like that. So you really have to find it within yourself. But I think it could be interesting.
You're a very sort of quiet, soft-spoken man, though. I mean, it must be rather a jarring experience to play in front of teeming masses holding up lighters. Or is that not the case?
Waving cans of Budweiser.
Right, exactly.
Well, no, it's not really a jarring experience. In fact, I mean, I get in a reflective mood when I'm talking to journalists, but when I'm performing or when I'm making music, then or making films or whatever, I'm a lot more energetic. Really, I tend to conserve my adrenaline during the day, and then it all explodes at night. That's really what a song Hyperactive is about. In the studio, I'd have maybe 45 minutes a day when I'd really go crazy, and the rest of the time I'd be sort of toing and froing and throwing ideas around. On stage on a good night, it will all come out, and I'll really come out of myself.
So it is pretty necessary to your life as a musician, then, to work.
Oh yeah. But there's this kind of interaction that happens live that doesn't happen anywhere else. There's no DJs, no record company executives or anything like that to get in between me and my audience. It's just they've paid to come in and they're there in front of me, and if the audience is responsive, if there's a good atmosphere, then I really start to perform.
Expect you here to do an actual concert.
Hopefully in the new year, I would say.
New year meaning about when?
Well, February, March, I suppose.
That's open to the schedule right now.
It's hard to say, really. I'll probably. I mean, I've got to see how it goes with this film script. That's going to be a fairly lengthy project. It might mean becoming invisible for a while. It's possible that before I get into it, I'll make another album. I mean, I've just come off the tour, and usually when I finish working live, then I get this kind of explosion of new song ideas. If I get enough of them, then I might decide to make another record and do a short tour before I really get into my film project. Though again, if the interest is there, then I'll probably immerse myself in that, and it's likely to be the end of next year before I get out and play live again.
Doesn't worry you, though, getting away from the music scene, losing your marketability, as they say?
I don't think I do lose my marketability. I mean, I think that there's this kind of fast food attitude to music predominant in the business at the moment. At the end of the month, you throw out this month's flavour with the dirty laundry. But I've never been like that, really. I think that what I'd like to end up is a little bit of an institution. I think that somebody like, well, all my heroes like Joni, like Van Morrison, like Kraftwerk or Brian Eno, they can easily disappear for a couple of years and make another record, and audience is still there.
Mm.
I mean, I have fans who are teenagers and probably won't like me this time next year because they would have grown out of me. Maybe their younger brothers and sisters would have grown into me. But I think more than a lot of current artists, I have a very wide-ranging audience, and I think a lot of my fans will buy my records willy-nilly. They won't have forgotten about me in a year's time.
How much say do you have in the way you're presented though by the record company? Do you just leave it all to them? I mean, like when they choose the singles.
They leave it all to me.
Oh, really? Well, what if they choose the singles though, right?
Up to a point, yeah. I mean, on my home ground, I tend to get very involved in those kind of decisions myself. I've always been quite involved in running my own business on the creative front, not the nitty-gritty front. I've always tended to communicate a lot with my record company, and although I get ideas from them, I will always voice a very strong opinion as to what I think would be the best single at any given time. Outside of England, it's more difficult because some markets are just so huge and unfathomable that it's very hard for me to know what would go down best. In the States, for example, generally, if I make an album, they will play it a little bit. They'll maybe try it out in a few DJs and radio consultants, and they'll say, well, this song seems to be getting a good response, let's go with it as a first single. And I say, fine, as long as we sell copies of the album, then I'm happy. But I'm not packaged at all by the record company. I tend to design my own photo sessions and as I say, I make my own videos and get quite involved with the record covers and so on.
Well, one thing that disappoints me is that the two big singles, Hyperactive and Science. I think they're giving you the image of wacky old Dolby. That's wacky old Dolby again. Whereas you have a song like Screen Kiss, which I think could really have a universal appeal, and that's not even planned to be released as a single, right?
Well, no, I mean, I Scare Myself was a very successful single in England, and that, I think, showed people a whole different side to what I was doing. The thing is that, singles are really a stepping stone for people to get into your music,
right.
And if it hadn't been for the accessibility of songs like Science and Hyperactive, then I wouldn't have introduced that many people to the material on my albums. And people who come backstage at concerts and so on, oddly enough, although in the heat of the moment they'll be screaming out for Science or Hyperactive or Europa, when they write to me or when they come and talk to me, it's usually about a song like Screen Kiss or like I Scare Myself. But that's always been the case. It was the same for the Beatles. It was the same for anybody really. The songs that will be remembered and not necessarily the hit singles.
I see. なんかあとその前に、映画作るんだからね、それは伸びるかもしれない。だから映画の制作が終わり次第来るということです。大体聞きました。All right. Well, thanks a lot for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
He wants to get some pictures.
Okay.
そこで。
ベランダで。I guess we want to get him out on the deck here.
Okay. Sure.